We're going to start today. Thanks all for joining us. Hopefully more will filter in here in a little bit. We have with us today Will Averill. He's the Director of Communications with the Willow and has been with the Willow since 2016. Will oversees outreach, education, communications, and social media for the agency and works to raise awareness of the issues surrounding domestic violence and human trafficking in our community. He has presented for organizations throughout the community at the Kansas Crime Victims' Rights Conference and has presented nationally on creating and maintaining engaging social media for nonprofits. And if you go to their website or their Facebook page, you can see his brilliant work in action. It's a really excellent, good job. Will has a lovely wife, Jacqueline, and a 6-year going on 23-year-old son, Oliver. And so Will is going to speak to us today to tell us about the Willow, the services it provides, and just kind of an overview of how we can help anyone that we think might be experiencing domestic violence. He's happy for you to just informally raise your hand, unmute yourself, ask a question at any time during the presentation. So proceed, Will. Thanks very much.
All right. No, thank you so much. Yeah, as Denise said, I'm happy for you to kind of pop in and ask questions at any time. I do have a bit of a presentation here, so we can kind of go through that. What I want to talk to you about a little bit today is domestic violence, what it is, and then what the Willow does to help folks who are caught in cycles of violence. So we're going to kind of go over the basics, what I like to call like the DV 101, what domestic violence is and how it may affect those around you or those within your community. And then we can talk at the end a little bit about Willow services and get you to some resources of what you can do to help. I did put in the chat I put together a DV toolkit, which contains some of this information, as well as some myths and facts about domestic violence. And that is something that you're welcome to come and download from the Willow site. I hope you will. I'd love to get your feedback on it. It's an opportunity to look into some of the things we talked about today and also give you a little handbook to help should you ever encounter a situation in which you are working with someone or assisting someone who is experiencing an abusive relationship. First of all, what is domestic violence? I think that a lot of folks start with kind of a stereotypical view of it, that it is one or multiple big physical altercations and fights in the street and shouting matches in other people's apartments and things like that. And that is, of course, a part of domestic violence. But what we tend to look at, rather than just isolated incidents of physical violence, or in addition to, is this pattern of behavior that is intended to create power and control by the abuser over the survivor, over the person that they are abusing. So that may be in some cases physical, but oftentimes it starts in different ways, and we'll talk a little bit about those ways. The way I like to put it is, if you went on a date with someone and they punched you on the first date, you're not going to go out with them again. And that's not how domestic violence works. Generally, it's this pattern that develops over, could be weeks, months, years, and begins a cycle which continues to grow in intensity and in frequency, and creates this pattern of power and control. So let's dig into that a little bit here. And again, if you have any questions, just do feel free to throw them in. Otherwise, I'll keep going and we'll do some Q&A at the end. What we have here is a handy template that we like to use when we talk about domestic violence, called the Power and Control Wheel. And if you kind of give it a look, you'll notice that physical violence and sexual violence are kind of on the outer rim there of that wheel, as being kind of the ultimate extensions of where this process is leading. But inside the wheel, there are a number of spokes that represent some of the different types of abuse. And when we talk about sort of non-physical abuse, we look at things like emotional abuse, which is criticizing, gaslighting, crazy making, and humiliation. Or isolation, which very often happens in the early stages of an abusive relationship. The abuser may take the survivor away from their family or friend networks, may move them to a different part of the country, or say things like, you know, your friends don't like me, I don't want to hang out with your friends, let's just hang out the two of us, and gradually whittle away at that person's support network until they don't have one, which makes that power and control easier to have. Blaming, minimizing, and denial, shifting any blame and responsibility for abuse onto the other person. You made me do this to you. That is oftentimes something that we hear and encounter. Even if it isn't a physical act, it can still be equally as damaging, because it's a lack of accountability and pushing one's actions onto someone else. Many times there will be use of children, friends, or loved ones, or even pets to maintain that control, threatening to hurt or harm any of those folks, threatening pets, threatening to take away access to children. These can all be a huge part of maintaining that power and control for an abuser. Societal privilege is that sort of king of the castle mentality. I deserve this. You are in my house. This is my house, and you will do what I say sort of mentality. Again, not always physical, but definitely a way in which one person is putting themselves above the needs of their partner. Economic and academic abuse, controlling what options the survivor has to both finances and to careers, jobs, educational opportunities, withholding money, giving out an allowance, things like this can be signs of that power and control. And then coercion and threats. One story that I heard recently was from a survivor whose partner would sit in the room with her and load his gun over and over again. And he never said anything directly. He would just sit there and load the gun as if to say, you know, I could shoot you if I wanted to. And that was enough of a threat with no physical violence to make this person afraid for her life. So as we see, these don't necessarily have to be physically violent to be dreadfully impactful. And the effect of this is that survivors are become in a difficult place. First of all, they're often isolated, and they feel isolated because oftentimes they have been taken away from that family and support network. There's depression that comes along with that, helplessness. Many times there's love involved, and they want the abuse to end, but not necessarily the relationship to end. And they may be unaware of services that are available to them, be embarrassed, or fear judgment or stigmatization. And that particularly happens in cultures in which there's a more kind of strong patriarchal tradition where one doesn't leave. That's not the way things are done. That can happen also in some religious and spiritual communities, where divorce is not seen as an option, or getting away is not seen as something that people do. They can be stigmatized by their own community. And that fear can be a very powerful fear in keeping someone in an abusive relationship. They may have guilt related to the relationship, may feel like they were partially to blame for this. And pro tip, a survivor is never to blame for their abuse. That's never a thing, but it does become easy to feel like one has let the situation occur. They may feel shame or anxiety, have suicidal thoughts, abuse alcohol and drugs, and again, just have that hope that their abuser will change, that the cycle will stop doing what it's doing. However, the majority of the time, unless the person who uses abuse is willing to hold themselves accountable for their actions, that won't happen. And instead, that cycle of violence will continue. And we'll talk a little bit about the cycle of violence here. You can look up a cycle of violence if you want a little more information on it. There are several different versions of this graphic that go into a lot more detail, some of them, but I like this one because it gives us just a broad idea of what's going on in a real simple to follow format. But each cycle of violence takes a certain amount of time, and it takes its own form, but follows kind of these various steps. There'll be, first of all, the honeymoon. And this is where kind of the relationship starts. Everything is great. The survivor or the abuser is treating the survivor very, very well. They're getting along. Everything's fantastic. However, then some of these problematic behaviors will start. Perhaps taking the person away from their family and friends, moving across the country, monitoring their social media, monitoring their phone calls and their texts, being jealous, texting multiple times, "Where are you?" when they're not around, wanting to know where they are all the time. Things like this build that tension up between the abuser and the survivor until there is an eruption of violence on the part of the abuser, which again does not have to be physical necessarily. It can be a shouting match. It can be throwing things across the room. But it is definitely an explosion of violence by the abusive partner that kind of that breaks the cycle for a moment, and then it returns back to the honeymoon. And they say, "So sorry, that's not me. That'll never happen again. This was a one-off." But then gradually that cycle will start to repeat itself. Those little behaviors will start to happen again and again and again, and the whole thing will continue on. Generally, this first time can take a long time. It can be a matter of months or years that it takes for this first cycle to kind of complete, but we almost always, again, unless the person who uses abuse is able to recognize that and take accountability, we almost always see the cycle happen again and again and again, and then also increase in frequency and in severity until it is leading to physical altercations and fights. And sometimes when this has gone on for a long time, you can see this cycle repeat itself multiple times within a day. So some elements of this may be familiar to you all from seeing relationships of other people in your lives that may have some of the cycle of violence attached to them. And it's just, I think it's an interesting way to look at it. And it's an interesting way to look again at that domestic violence as a pattern rather than isolated incidents. To give you an idea of how prevalent domestic violence is, 1 in 3 women, 1 in 4 men, and 30 to 50% of trans and non-binary folks will experience intimate partner violence within their lifetime. So it's a staggering amount of people, and the relationships are not easy to get out of. The statistic is that it can take up to 7 times for a survivor to finally leave an abusive relationship. And we'll talk a little bit about that here in a minute. There are a lot of barriers to leaving that make it very, very difficult. So when we have people come in, we know that we may not always be getting them straight out into new lives right away, that it may be something that we may work with someone 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 10 times before they are finally able to make that leaving stick. We have a 24-hour hotline that got 3,369 calls last year. This was during the pandemic, and we were also able to provide 4,035 nights of safe rest. And that is for members of our community, which is not just Lawrence, but also Douglas County, Franklin County, and Jefferson County. So that gives you an idea of kind of how prevalent it is. We really like to push people to look at domestic violence not as a private or a family affair, which it often has been, but rather take a look at it as a public health crisis, because it does profoundly affect the communities in which it happens, both emotionally and financially. It costs over, I believe, $7 billion worldwide annually in lost wages, lost work, and emergency services. Domestic violence does. So it is an expensive and damaging problem, not just for the lives directly involved, but also for the communities in which they live.
Hey,
Let's talk about some. Oh, yeah, go ahead. Yes.
I had a question. What increase was that during the pandemic year from previous years? Do you have that stat?
It was. I don't have a specific number, but it was about 20%. I can tell you that we saw about a 20% increase both in call volumes and in requests for intake. We also had the dual issue of having to adhere to public health and safety standards for our staff and for our clients. So our capacity was down too. So it made it even more difficult, in which case we had to try to find alternate ways like hotels or purchasing bus tickets out of state. Anywhere we could, kind of get somebody to safety, we did. But definitely, I think it's in terms of the calls and the severity of the incidents, they were up because that isolation creates a perfect storm for abusers because they're in the same space together all the time for a long time with less access to outside support networks such as employment or being able to get out to the gym or the salon or restaurants or anywhere where they can potentially talk to somebody about it. Those opportunities were all gone. So it definitely was increasing in severity during that time.
Yeah. You said 20%?
20%, yes.
20. Yeah. Thanks.
Yep. So when people think about domestic violence, many times I think there's that perception that it's like a middle-aged white guy in a tank top with a baseball cap, swigging beer, watching football, and hitting people, and that is not the case. So what we need to look for is the fact that abuse can happen in any social strata. Oftentimes people blame anger, saying it's an anger management issue. However, abusers are able to control that anger when there are situations in which they need to, for example, in the workplace or in church or within their social communities. They're able to keep that anger to themselves with most people except for their victims. So and also bear in mind that not all people with anger management are abusers. So it's a situation where it can exacerbate an existing situation, but it is not the cause. The same with drugs and alcohol. Not all those who abuse substances or alcohol are necessarily abusers. And those who do, it may make that abuse worse and may make that cycle happen faster, but it is not the root cause. Poverty is often blamed. However, we see an equal amount of folks from all social stratas who come in. Sometimes the resource needs are a little bit different. Folks who are kind of who are in the upper class stratas oftentimes may not need shelter necessarily because they may have the capacity, but they oftentimes are looking for community services and assistance with court. Self-esteem issues. Many folks talk about abusers as having low self-esteem, but what we actually find is that the opposite is true, particularly with abusers who have a high social standing within their community. They actually have excellent self-esteem, and that they are the abuse comes from the entitlement and the feeling that they are that they're entitled to this. They're entitled to have this control over the people in their lives that they practice that power and control over, that is theirs to have and theirs to do with what they like. So it's not necessarily a low self-esteem thing. It very often can be high self-esteem can be equally engaged in an abuser's toolkit. And finally, the cycle of abuse. And again, this is another area where there's correlation, but not necessarily causation. Being involved in a cycle of abuse from an early age can create conditions where one is comfortable with that pattern. However, not everybody who is abused or traumatized as a child turns out to be an abuser, and so therefore it is not an excuse for an abuser to abuse, which it oftentimes gets used as. And again, when we look at what causes DV, it's not trauma. It's the abuser still needs to have accountability and responsibility for their own actions, and that's really what we see in relationships where they're abusive and they're not getting any better. Is there's no accountability. The idea is that you've done this to me. This is something that I am having to do because of the way that you are behaving, and it's that power and control. But then abusers will use that childhood experience to say, well, look, I'm like this because this is how I was raised. But it's not until they take accountability and actually start to look at their actions and change them that you can have progress on that front. Also, just to point out that many adult survivors also have a history of childhood trauma. So it does work both ways with childhood trauma. This is a quote that I read and loved. You're not responsible for the pain others have caused you, but you are responsible for taking ownership of that pain and not transferring it to others. And we don't have an in-house batterers intervention program at the Willow, but we do work with a couple of organizations that provide batterers intervention. And what that is an ongoing program for folks who have abused to look at the abuse that they have done, look at their sort of patterns, take accountability for their actions, and find better ways to move forward without continuing that cycle and that abuse. Going back to barriers to leaving, I said we were going to talk a little bit more about this. There's so many barriers for survivors, and we often get the question, why didn't they just leave? And I've really grown to not like that question, because I think we should rephrase it and rephrase it to, why did they think it was okay to hit somebody? That's really the question that we should be asking, rather than putting the emphasis on the survivor to make the change. But unfortunately, the way that our society and our laws are structured, the vast majority of the work of making a positive change in a domestic violence situation is placed on a survivor who's already in trauma. And that in and of itself makes leaving incredibly difficult. In addition to that, you have oftentimes the religious and cultural beliefs, as I mentioned earlier, where divorce is not done or not an option, or leaving is not done or not an option. It can alienate one from one's own community. Lack of support from family and friends, either an actual lack of support or a perceived lack of support. Oftentimes, the abuser will have ground down the survivor's self-esteem so much they don't believe anybody would want to help them. Community backlash, particularly in some tight-knit communities, fear that there will be kind of a larger backlash for it. Lack of resources is a huge one. Taking that financial abuse is very, very common, and taking someone's money away, their credit cards, checks, any access to funds, oftentimes even their documentation, driver's licenses, social security cards, passports. I mean, imagine trying to get started with none of that. It's incredibly difficult to contemplate, even without the trauma of an abusive relationship on top of it. Children and pets, again, they oftentimes people will stay in relationships that are not healthy because they are afraid what will happen to their children. Survivors are 8 times more likely to stay in abusive relationships when there are pets involved, because abusers will frequently threaten pets or threaten to harm animals, and they feel like they have to stay in order to keep their pets safe. Particularly for underserved and minority populations, fear or distrust of law enforcement. Law enforcement are there to keep the peace. They are not social workers, nor should they be, and therefore are not trained. I mean, there more and more training is happening, and we're beginning to see more and more partnerships occurring where we're getting some more nuanced training for officers. But at the end of the day, particularly for minority populations, it could be more damaging to have law enforcement involved and escalate the situation more than if they were not. And so there can be this real fear and distrust of contacting enforcement, even when that enforcement would seem to be the right choice. Financial barriers, again, I've talked about that. Oftentimes they don't have any access to funds, and that can be a huge disadvantage. In rural communities, it may be a situation where even if someone can call the sheriff won't show up for 20 minutes, and by then it may be too late. So rural isolation is a really difficult problem that we deal with, particularly in Franklin and Jefferson County, when we try to keep our survivors safe, and they may not be able to or feel comfortable calling law enforcement, because it's going to take them a long time to get there, and if they get there, then they'll get there and leave, and it could be a worse situation after that. Fear of further abuse. Half of all women who are murdered by a current or ex-partner. It's a huge, staggering number, and the first 72 hours after leaving is the most dangerous time for a survivor. So there is a very real fear of abuse or retaliation, and that's not taking into account if there are children and pets involved, which can add a whole nother layer. So that can be a large enough fear to keep some people from leaving, because they're worried that things, as bad as things are now, they will be worse if they try to leave. And then, of course, love. From time to time, it's folks are very much in love with the person who is abusing them, and think that they may change or don't want to leave them because they love them, and that is part of being human. And it's messy, but it is a fact that we see often as a barrier to leaving. So in terms of how you can help folks if you see abuse occurring, there are a couple of things that I like to give to people for information on how to handle this. The first is what we call trauma-informed care. And trauma-informed care is really just taking people at their word and that this trauma and abuse has occurred, and not trying to offer advice or solutions, but listening and working with them to get resources and information that they may need. To that point, gathering information on your local domestic violence and human trafficking shelters. There's ourselves, the Willow. In our community, there's also the Sexual Abuse and Trauma Care Center, and they're great. They deal primarily with sexual assault, but our areas do overlap from time to time. In terms of human trafficking, we do have a human trafficking program, but there's also Latte is another organization in town that deals with trafficking. So you can look at a resource list. We do have resource lists available on our website. There's also some resources on the DV toolkit, but get to know those. We always love it when people reach out and just ask questions. So you can always call our hotline, even if you don't necessarily have an issue. If you just want to ask a question or want some clarity on a situation that you think may be potentially abusive, we can help you with that. We're happy to kind of talk that through with you. Believe survivors. I think this is the kind of key thing. We oftentimes, particularly if the abuser is someone in a town like Lawrence, we're a relatively small and tight-knit community, and there are people in town who you would be really surprised if you found out they were an abuser, and your inclination might be to say, no, that can't be true. But remember that there is really there are very few cases of survivors lying about this sort of thing, in part because the repercussions are so heavy for doing so, particularly if you get into courts of law enforcement, that it is definitely not worth it. So believing survivors is a key point. It will help you to start to gather the information that you need and work with them to get them help. And remember also that a survivor is the expert in their own lives, and we have to be aware of this too. Sometimes it's not in the best interest of the survivor to leave an abusive relationship at that time. It could be that the abuser is the only person who makes money in the relationship, and if they were to leave, they wouldn't have any financial resources and they would end up homeless. Or it could be that there are other reasons that you don't know about that they need to be in that relationship at that time. So if someone tells you that they're not ready to leave, then you're not, we don't want to push that. We never do as an agency. We just look to say, okay, well, how can we keep you as safe as we can keep you where you are and where you need to be? We do require at the Willow that the survivor be the one to call in and talk to us if shelter is going to be an option. The reason for that is that we don't want to. We want to make sure that, because we're an empowerment-based agency, that the survivor is ready to make that transition into group living, because it is a relatively abrupt, it can be a very difficult transition. But you can sit with someone or ask someone else to sit with someone if they're more comfortable with that, and call and be there just to be a moral support. It's often very, very powerful. A huge part of advocacy is just being there and being an ear and listening. And this is where you can do that. You can just say, you know what, I know about the Willow. I know that they take folks. Let's call together, and I'll just be here while you talk to them. If anything comes up and you need help, I can help you. But I'll just be an extra support. And that is very often enough to help someone who maybe was on the edge about getting services to move over to getting those services. Avoid giving advice. It's very easy to want to tell people what to do and how to live their lives. And you may think that you've got the best piece of advice ever, but remember, going back to a survivor being the expert in their own lives, there may be factors that you don't know playing into this. And there may be reasons beyond what you know that are keeping that person there. So I would always recommend listening, having those resources on hand, and then learning maybe a little bit about safety planning, so you could say well, let me talk you through ways in which we can get you ready should you choose to leave, and things which we can do to make sure that you're safe in your home while you take these steps or while you figure that out. And again, remember, a survivor will attempt to leave up to 7 times before successfully leaving, and that some of those steps are incremental. It can be very easy to get frustrated because you see somebody and you're just like, come on, let's get through this. Let's move this along. And what you have to realize is that even if people don't make it out of an abusive relationship the first time, there are all of those barriers, and it could be a combination of any and all of those barriers that are keeping them there. But if you can just help them to make some incremental progress, and this is what we try to do, just make some incremental progress each time, that'll get them closer and closer. And sometimes just having the information on hand can move somebody just that much further along, or making that offer to call, even if they say no, maybe they'll know that that offer is there, and then a month, 2 months down the line, they'll be like, hey, remember when we talked about that? I'd like to make that call now. So don't feel like, any step along that way is a failure, just part of a process of a cycle of a very difficult problem to untangle. And then offer a safety plan. We have some resources on our website. Also, a Google search for safety planning will yield some good results. I encourage everybody who I do workshops for to learn at least the basics of safety planning. And what safety planning is basically talking through. It can be a couple of things. It can be talking through what people might need in order to leave, like where can you put some money so you'll have it if you need it? Where can you put your documents so you have them when you need them? What rooms in your house lock so you can get to safety in case of a physical altercation? Are there exits from your home in case your abuser is blocking the front door? Things like that. So you can try to keep people as safe in their homes as possible. And anybody can do that. You don't have to be an advocate to do that. You can look it up on one of the Google sites, look up safety plans. Also, loveisrespect.org has some great safety planning in it as well. So I would say if you're interested in that, those are the places to go. Or you can call the Willow, and we'd be happy to safety plan with you and the client. So if you say, look, I don't feel comfortable making a safety plan, but I know that the Willow can, so call with me. And again, you can sit there with them during the call and help get that plan in place. So about us, we serve all survivors of domestic violence and human trafficking in Douglas, Franklin, and Jefferson counties in Kansas. We provide free confidential services. No documentation is required. So we serve all communities, not just women. Oftentimes people still believe that we're just a women's shelter, and while that is a part of what we do, we're far more now than just a shelter, and we serve all survivors and not just women. Our hotline is 24 hours and staffed by trained advocates. The number is 785-843-3333. We have now 2 shelters, one with 28 beds and one with 20 beds. Each of those shelters allows for survivors to stay for 90 days. Which is great. We used to have a 30-day stay, and that was just not enough time to try to start to rebuild, especially for someone who would come in with nothing but the clothes on their back. 30 days was way too short. 90 days gives us a little more time to work with them on a regular basis, to come up with goals, educational, career, transportation, living arrangements, things like that. Try to get housing vouchers for them if they need housing. Try to arrange to make sure that they're in the best possible place that they can be to make a positive step forward. We have a court advocacy program for many folks. The court is the first time that they will see their abuser after they have left. And as I said, the first 72 hours is the most dangerous. So it can be a very traumatic time for survivors. We have advocates who go to domestic violence dockets in all 3 counties, and they introduce themselves to folks who are there for DV dockets. And they talk to them about our services and ask them if they'd like support, and then sit with them if they like throughout the court hearing, so that they are not alone with their abuser at that time. We have community advocacy for folks who may not need shelter, but do still need some material assistance. And we're able to offer help with rent, with utilities, with getting internet sometimes, with getting transportation to and from appointments. That's all done through our community advocacy program. We have a one-of-a-kind, incredibly unique and wonderful transitional housing program, which, as far as I know, as far as I can, my research has gone, is the only transitional housing program of its kind that is specifically for domestic violence survivors. We have one house called the Restoration House with 4 apartments, excuse me, and then we have 6 single-family homes. And those are all let out with the help of tenants to homeowners, who does the property management, for 1 to 2 year leases, at which time we have a case manager who works with clients to help get their goals set up. We have had a fantastic success with this recently. We had a survivor who came in with his daughter, and they started in our shelter program. They were able to move from shelter into our transitional housing, stayed for about 2 years. And during this time, our survivor was able to go to culinary school part-time, and he has now graduated culinary school and is working as a chef, and has saved up money to get a permanent apartment for him and his daughter, and has just recently left us. And so that's a fantastic story. And programs around the country have an 80% positive rate. 80% of the folks who do these transitional housing programs end up in permanent housing. We haven't done our program long enough to have statistics for it like that yet, but I think we'll come out around that number. So I think it's a very, very positive program. It's making a huge impact for survivors in our community. We also offer a human trafficking program. So if you have questions about human trafficking, or would like a presentation on human trafficking, we can totally provide that. We screen for trafficking when we bring people into shelter. The thing about trafficking is some folks are being trafficked without knowing that they're necessarily being trafficked. So that can create a kind of tricky area. And also occasionally traffickers who look for people who are in vulnerable situations will send in folks to try and recruit people in shelter. So we have to be a little bit wary of that. And human trafficking is treated just a little bit differently in the way we work with those clients to make sure they get what they need, and that those needs that are specific to trafficking are addressed. We also have youth violence prevention services and children's services in shelter, and then education and outreach such as this. And also we have a program that we've recently launched called Claire's Community, which we're looking to build a network of mentors who work with youth within the community to kind of have honest conversations about domestic violence. It was a program that was partnered with Be More Like Claire, which is a local organization that is in honor of Claire Van Landringham, a local woman who was murdered by her ex-partner, and her mother, Shannon Van Landringham, felt that she didn't have the vocabulary to talk about this relationship and the problems of this relationship with her daughter, and felt that if she might have been able to say the right thing to help her at the time that she needed it. So this program is partially to address that, to give kids and also to give adult mentors the words, the vocabulary, and the knowledge that they need to navigate those kind of tricky, difficult conversations surrounding healthy relationships and domestic violence. So very excited about that program, and hopefully we'll be building more mentors within the community over the coming year. So we also have a series of events throughout the year, both online and in person. I'm hoping next year that we can get back to more in person, because I don't know about y'all, but I'm starting to get a little tired of Zoom meetings. Looking forward to meeting people in person again and getting out in the community. So hopefully next year we can do more of that. That's kind of what we do in a nutshell, and a little bit about domestic violence. Further resources, you can always find more information on our website, willowdvcenter.org. Again, that the DV toolkit is a real handy kind of follow-up to what we talked about here today. got the power and control wheel in it, information, myths and facts about DV, how to help, and some resources in there. And then I always do recommend the national hotline for if you know of anybody who's not in our area who may need this information, the ncadv.org, or the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence, has a hotline which allows you to kind of find out where the domestic violence organizations are in all 50 states. So that's a real handy resource if you're dealing with a situation that's out of our immediate area. So that's about it. I can take any questions that you've got at this time.
Thanks, Will. I got big feedback. Is that better there now? So thanks so much, Will. I wondered about, oh yeah, thanks. You did the NCADV there in the chat. I wondered about with certain communities, Native American communities, I was looking on your website or your Facebook page, and their rate of domestic violence, is that significantly different from other populations in the United States?
Well, Native American communities statistically, they have the highest percentage of domestic violence incidents of any community in the last polling that was done, which unfortunately they don't do polling on this very often. So the latest data that we have is 2008. I don't imagine it's significantly changed. There are a lot of rules and laws surrounding tribal communities and reservations that are real antiquated and create kind of conditions which are more conducive to abuse. In fact, until a few years ago, it was entirely possible for someone to go on to a reservation and abuse or murder a Native American woman and leave the reservation and not be charged for it, because it was federal land, and the way the laws worked, you couldn't charge for a crime that had happened on the tribal land outside of the tribal land. Now those laws have since been changed, but there's not a lot of attention paid to looking into and addressing domestic violence within the Native community. In addition, oftentimes Native populations are distrustful of public services for, I think, very justifiable reasons, and therefore will be reticent to take access to community resources when they could be helpful resources. So we continue to work with Haskell here in town to provide presentations and information as best we can. But yeah, it is a difficult situation, and the number of missing and murdered Indigenous women is higher than any other population, and is really a difficult and depressing subject, and a stain on our communities, because it is far too prevalent and far too underreported.
Yeah, the attention that the recently disappeared white woman got nationwide, just the huge blow up of that. And yet, the comparison with here are the other numbers of murder, missing Indigenous women. So yeah, it's a big disparity in public attention or public fascination with, or whatever you want to call it. Yeah.
We definitely, it's definitely difficult to get domestic violence out of the idea that it is a private problem into the public sphere. But I really want to change that conversation, because it is something that affects us as a country, and it is something that affects us both financially and health-wise as communities. And until we recognize that and start to address it, we're not going to make progress on it. And it's a combination, I think, of legislation and changing values of some of our values lend themselves towards viewing women even as property in some places. And until we address that through legislation, and until we really take it seriously, we're going to keep seeing it happen.
Yeah.
Any other questions? All right. Well, thank you so much for your time. I always like to mention, time is the most valuable resource that you have, and I appreciate you're giving it to me to talk about this for a little while. If you'd like to help our organization, the number one thing you can do is absolutely free, and that is talk about it. Talk about domestic violence. Take down our number. Take down our details. Let people know that you've seen the presentation, recommend it. Anything you can do to get the word of mouth out. Like I said, it is still our biggest draw. Despite all our internet presence and social media, the way that most people find out about us is through word of mouth. So if you could spread the good word, that would be amazing. If you want to help out with our holiday drive this year, we're not doing gifts this year as we previously done. You can certainly donate to our Support the Willow holiday campaign to make sure that we get gifts and supplies for the folks in our shelter. If you'd ever like to do a drive or anything, we have our urgent needs list, and we very often need things like ethnic hair care products, diapers in larger sizes, and newborn and laundry pods, things like that, disposables. We don't unfortunately have a lot of room for things like clothing and furniture because we're a small organization, but those consumables we can use, especially things related to kind of hygiene and care products. So that's just some things you can do. I would recommend you check out the toolkit. It's a real handy way to kind of get some information that we talked about and have those resources available.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for your time today, Will.
All right, thank you.
And
have a great afternoon.
See you down the road. Bye-bye.
All right, sounds great. I'm going to stop sharing here. Get out.